When we speak of the day an empath stops wanting to be understood, we are not speaking of a collapse, nor of a failure of love, nor of a bitterness that has finally soured the soul. We are speaking of a psychic event, subtle yet decisive, that marks a turning point in the individuation process. I ask you, as you sit here listening to me, not to imagine this empath as a modern label or a fashionable identity, but as a timeless psychological configuration, one that has existed wherever the human psyche has been sensitive, porous, and attuned to the invisible currents between souls. Such a person lives, often unknowingly, with a nervous system that is open like an unguarded city gate, receiving impressions, moods, unspoken conflicts, and symbolic tensions long before they take conscious form in others. From early life, this person learns that connection is survival, that attunement is safety, and that being understood is equivalent to being allowed to exist. Yet the psyche is never content to remain in its earliest adaptations. What once preserved life can later suffocate it. The empath, as I am describing this figure, is often a child who learned too early to read the weather of the room, who became fluent in silence, in tone, in the micro-movements of the soul of the other. This child learned that harmony must be maintained, that understanding must be offered even when it is not returned, that the burden of meaning must be carried inward rather than spoken outward. Over time, this adaptation becomes a moral identity, a sense of being the one who understands, the one who explains, the one who bridges the gap between inner worlds. And here, already, we see the seed of tragedy, for the psyche does not tolerate one-sidedness without consequence. I have often observed in my patients, and indeed within my own inner work, that the desire to be understood can become a compulsion as binding as any addiction. It is not merely the wish to be seen, which is natural, but the unconscious belief that if one could only find the right words, the right tone, the right explanation, then suffering would finally be redeemed. The empath explains not because the other truly listens, but because the psyche is still searching for an external witness to validate its inner reality. This search can continue for decades, exhausting the soul while leaving the core untouched. Now consider what happens when this desire begins to fail. Not dramatically at first, but quietly, like a river changing its course beneath the surface of frozen ground. The empath notices that explanations no longer bring relief, that being understood, even when it happens, does not restore energy but depletes it further. There is a dawning recognition that the act of constant translation, of turning inner truth into palatable language for others, has become a form of self-betrayal. This is not yet liberation. It is the beginning of disillusionment. And disillusionment is always painful because it strips away the myths that once gave life meaning. At this stage, dreams often change. The empath may dream of speaking and no one hearing, or of shouting across a vast landscape where sound is swallowed by fog. Sometimes the dream reverses itself, and the dreamer is silent while others speak endlessly, their words forming an indistinct hum. These images are not signs of withdrawal from life, as is often feared, but messages from the unconscious that a psychic economy has become unbalanced. The psyche is saying, in its symbolic language, that something essential has been overgiven, that the well has been drawn from without replenishment. Here we must introduce the shadow, that neglected companion of consciousness. The empath's shadow is not cruelty or indifference in the usual sense, but a forbidden firmness, a capacity for separation, a willingness to let misunderstanding exist without rushing to heal it, because the empath has identified so strongly with understanding. The shadow carries all that is ununderstanding, all that refuses to explain, all that stands silent even when misinterpreted. This shadow is often projected onto others, who are then experienced as cold, dismissive, or incapable of depth. Yet what is rejected outside is precisely what seeks integration within. The day the empath stops wanting to be understood is, psychologically speaking, the day this shadow begins to cross the threshold of consciousness. It does not arrive with violence, but with a strange calm, sometimes even with guilt. There is a moment, subtle yet unmistakable, when the empath feels an inner no arise where there was once an automatic yes. The impulse to clarify fades. The urge to correct misconceptions loosens its grip. Silence, once terrifying, becomes neutral, even protective. This is not withdrawal from relationship. It is withdrawal from the compulsion to earn belonging through self-exposure. From the standpoint of individuation, this moment is crucial. Individuation does not mean becoming isolated or self-sufficient in a crude sense. It means becoming whole, which often requires a renunciation of roles that once defined us. The empath has long played the role of the interpreter of souls, the emotional translator, the psychic mediator. To relinquish this role feels, at first, like a death. And indeed it is a symbolic death, for the old identity cannot survive without the constant confirmation that being understood once provided. Many fear that this turning inward signals bitterness or emotional shutdown. But the unconscious tells a different story. When we examine the fantasies and dreams that follow this shift, we often see images of boundaries, thresholds, doors that close not in hostility but in necessity. The psyche is learning containment. It is discovering that not every inner truth must be made conscious to others, that some meanings ripen only in solitude. The empath begins, perhaps for the first time, to experience the dignity of inner life without witnesses. This dignity is often misunderstood by the outer world. Others may say the empath has changed, has become distant, has grown cold. Yet from within, the experience is not of coldness but of consolidation. Psychic energy that was once dispersed through constant explanation now gathers around the self. The center of gravity shifts. Meaning is no longer negotiated externally, but lived internally. This is why the empath who stops wanting to be understood often appears quieter, less reactive, less invested in persuasion. The psyche has withdrawn its projections and reclaimed its substance. I must emphasize that this process is not a moral victory, nor is it an endpoint. It is a phase, albeit a decisive one, in the long dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious. If the empath clings to silence as a new identity, the process stagnates. But if silence is allowed to be what it truly is, a space in which the soul can hear itself, then something new emerges. Out of this silence arises a form of expression that no longer seeks validation. Words, when they return, carry weight because they are no longer offered as pleas for recognition, but as expressions of inner necessity. In alchemical terms, this is the movement from dissolution to coagulation. The empath's psyche, long dissolved in the waters of others' needs and perceptions, begins to take form. The prima materia, once scattered, is gathered. This is why the experience often feels both relieving and unsettling. One feels more solid, yet less accessible, more present, yet less available. This paradox is not to be resolved, but endured, for it is the hallmark of psychological maturation. Let us consider the archetypal dimension of this moment. The empath corresponds, in many mythological systems, to the wounded healer, the one who knows suffering intimately and therefore recognizes it in others. But every archetype has its shadow. And the wounded healer who never stops healing others bleeds endlessly. At some point, the archetype demands reversal. The healer must become the one who withholds healing, who allows wounds to exist without immediate intervention. This is not abandonment, it is respect for the autonomy of the other psyche. To stop wanting to be understood is, at a deeper level, to stop assuming responsibility for the inner world of others. This realization often arrives not through theory, but through exhaustion. The psyche teaches through suffering when insight is resisted. The empath may reach a point where the body itself rebels, where fatigue, anxiety, or numbness signal that the old pattern has become unsustainable. When understanding no longer nourishes but drains, the unconscious intervenes. It withdraws libido from the relational field and redirects it inward. What feels like emotional detachment is, in fact, a reorientation of psychic energy. I have seen individuals at this stage worry that they are becoming selfish. But selfishness is not the same as selfhood. Selfishness inflates the ego. Selfhood anchors it. The empath who stops wanting to be understood is not saying, only I matter, but rather, I matter enough not to disappear. This distinction is subtle yet profound. It marks the difference between egoic defense and genuine individuation. As this process unfolds, the inner dialogue deepens. The empath begins to listen not to the imagined reactions of others, but to the voice of the self. That organizing center of the psyche which transcends the ego, this voice does not demand explanation. It does not ask to be justified. It speaks in symbols, in moods, in quiet convictions that resist translation. To live in relation to this voice requires courage, for it often leads one away from familiar relational dynamics and into unknown terrain. In this terrain, loneliness may appear, but it is a different loneliness than before. It is not the loneliness of being unseen, but the loneliness of standing apart. This loneliness has a creative quality. It is the solitude from which genuine individuality arises. Without it, the empath remains trapped in reflection, defined by the needs and perceptions of others. With it, the empath begins to exist as a psychological fact rather than a relational function. I will pause here, not because the process ends, but because what follows belongs to the continuation of this inner journey, where silence matures into presence, and presence into a new form of relatedness that no longer depends on being understood to be real. When this new form of loneliness enters the life of the empath, it often arrives without drama. There is no grand declaration, no conscious vow of withdrawal. Rather, there is a subtle loosening of the inner grip, as though a clenched fist has finally relaxed after years of tension. The empath notices that misunderstandings no longer provoke the same inner urgency, that being misread does not feel like an existential threat. This is a sign that the ego has relinquished its dependence on mirroring. The psyche no longer requires constant confirmation from the outside to maintain its coherence. This is not indifference, it is differentiation. At this point, something deeply paradoxical occurs. The empath, who once believed that being understood was the gateway to intimacy, begins to experience a deeper form of relatedness precisely through not explaining, by allowing others to misunderstand, by refusing the compulsion to correct every false image. The empath grants the other psyche its freedom. Projection is no longer intercepted and managed. It is allowed to unfold and eventually to collapse under its own weight. This is a subtle but profound act of psychological respect. One no longer intrudes upon the psychic development of others by rescuing them from their own misinterpretations. Here we encounter a difficult truth that many resist. Understanding does not always heal. In some cases, it delays growth. When the empath constantly explains themselves, they unconsciously deprive others of the opportunity to confront their own shadows, their own distortions, their own limitations of perception. By stepping back, the empath allows reality to perform its necessary work. This withdrawal is not punitive, it is archetypal. It mirrors the movement of the wise old figure who speaks sparingly, whose silence carries more meaning than words ever could. In dreams, this stage may be accompanied by images of empty rooms, vast landscapes, or solitary figures walking at dusk. These images are often misinterpreted as symbols of loss. Yet if we attend carefully to their emotional tone, we often find not despair but spaciousness. The unconscious is portraying the clearing of inner space. Where once there was cluttered dialogue, endless rehearsal of conversations, imagined explanations and justifications, there is now room, and in this room, something unexpected begins to form. That something is authority, not authority over others, but inner authority. The empath begins to trust their own experience without submitting it to collective judgment. This is a critical threshold in individuation. Until this point, the ego has been oriented toward consensus, toward harmony, toward being acceptable and intelligible. Now it turns toward coherence with the self. The question shifts from "do they understand me?" to "is this true for me?" This shift is subtle, but it reorganizes the entire psychic structure. It is here that many empaths encounter resistance from their environment. Relationships that were built on constant emotional availability may strain or dissolve. Others may feel abandoned, confused, or even threatened by the empath's newfound quiet. This reaction is not incidental. When one person withdraws from a familiar role, the unconscious contracts of relationship are exposed. What was once mutual may reveal itself as asymmetrical. The empath who once carried the emotional weight for two stops compensating, and the imbalance becomes visible. This can provoke guilt, for the empath has long equated goodness with self-sacrifice. But guilt, in this context, is a relic of an outdated moral code, one that confuses individuation with selfishness. The psyche must learn a new ethic, one grounded not in endless accommodation, but in truthfulness to one's own limits, to say nothing, to step back, to refuse explanation, can be as ethical as speaking, if it arises from fidelity to the self rather than fear. I have observed that when this stage is resisted, symptoms often intensify. Anxiety, resentment, or a sense of inner deadness may emerge. These are not signs that silence is wrong, but that it has not yet been consciously integrated. The ego still clings to its old identity as the one who understands, the one who heals, the one who keeps the emotional fabric intact. Letting go of this identity feels like betrayal, not only of others, but of oneself. And yet, without this betrayal, no new center can form. The unconscious, however, is patient. It will continue to present images, feelings, and situations that press the issue. The empath may repeatedly encounter moments where explanation feels impossible, where words dry up, where silence asserts itself without conscious choice. These moments are initiatory. They force the ego to confront its own limits. Language, that most human of tools, reveals its inadequacy, and in that inadequacy, a deeper mode of being becomes possible. This deeper mode is characterized by presence rather than persuasion. The empath no longer tries to be understood. They simply are. Their words, when spoken, are no longer defensive or justificatory. They are statements of fact, expressions of inner alignment. This often gives them a weight that surprises both the speaker and the listener. What was once verbose becomes concise. What was once emotionally charged becomes calm. This is not emotional numbing, but emotional containment. Contained emotion has a different quality than expressed emotion. It is denser, more potent, less diffuse. When the empath learns to contain rather than discharge their inner life, they begin to radiate a quiet intensity. Others may sense this and respond with curiosity, respect, or unease. The empath is no longer transparent, no longer easily read, and this opacity, far from being a flaw, is a sign of psychic depth. In archetypal terms, the empath has moved from the role of the open vessel to that of the sealed one, not sealed in the sense of closed or dead, but sealed in the alchemical sense, where transformation can occur without leakage. The alchemists knew that without containment, the work fails. The empath's previous openness, while adaptive, prevented such containment. Now, with boundaries in place, the inner work can proceed. This inner work often brings the empath into contact with aspects of themselves that were previously disowned. Anger, firmness, even a capacity for withdrawal or rejection may surface. These qualities are not new. They were merely relegated to the shadow because they conflicted with the empath's self-image. As they are integrated, the personality becomes more balanced, more whole. Compassion remains, but it is no longer compulsive. Understanding remains possible, but it is no longer demanded. It is important to note that this process does not eliminate the desire for relationship. On the contrary, it refines it. The empath no longer seeks connection through overexposure, but through resonance. They become selective, not out of fear, but out of discernment. Relationships that emerge at this stage tend to be quieter, slower, and more reciprocal. There is less need to explain because there is less need to defend one's existence. The day the empath stops wanting to be understood, then is not an ending but a beginning. It marks the transition from a life oriented around response to a life oriented around presence. The psyche shifts from adaptation to expression, from survival to meaning. This transition is rarely recognized or celebrated, for it lacks outward drama, yet inwardly it is one of the most significant movements a person can make. If we follow this path further, we find that the empath eventually returns to speech, but it is a different speech. It is not the speech of the wounded child seeking recognition, but the speech of the individuated adult who speaks from alignment with the self. Such speech does not aim to convince or to be understood. It simply articulates what is and allows others to meet it or not on their own terms. This, ultimately, is the psychological freedom that lies at the heart of individuation. To exist without needing to be understood is not to renounce humanity, but to embody it more fully. It is to accept the fundamental solitude of the soul, not as a curse, but as the ground from which authentic connection can finally arise. I will continue from here, for the journey does not end with silence, but with a transformed way of being with others and with oneself, one that emerges only after the compulsion to be understood has been laid to rest, when this transformed way of being begins to settle into the personality. The empath often notices a strange reversal of forces. What once felt heavy now feels light. What once felt urgent now feels distant. The psyche, having withdrawn its compulsive need for recognition, regains a quiet sovereignty. This sovereignty is not dominance, nor is it detachment in the sense of emotional sterility. It is the sovereignty of a center that no longer orbits the expectations, interpretations, or misunderstandings of others. The empath stands, perhaps for the first time, on inner ground that does not shift with every relational tremor. At this stage, a subtle fear may arise, one that is rarely spoken, the fear of becoming invisible. For so long, the empath's sense of existence was intertwined with responsiveness, with emotional visibility, with being the one who notices and names what others cannot. To stop wanting to be understood can feel, at an unconscious level, like stepping out of the human circle, and yet, paradoxically, this fear reveals how deeply the empath had equated visibility with worth. The psyche must now learn that being real does not require being mirrored. In many cases, the unconscious addresses this fear through symbolic compensation. Dreams may show the empath as a solitary figure, not lost, but luminous, carrying a lantern through darkness, or standing on a mountain while others move below in obscurity. These images are not grandiose, they are corrective. They suggest that withdrawal from explanation is not disappearance, but elevation of perspective. One sees further when one is no longer entangled in constant exchange. This elevation brings with it a painful clarity. The empath begins to recognize how often their understanding was used as a substitute for intimacy, how others relied on being understood without ever seeking to understand in return. This realization can provoke grief, even anger, for it exposes the asymmetry of many relationships once idealized as deep or meaningful. But this grief is necessary. It marks the mourning of illusions, and without mourning, the psyche cannot move forward. The danger at this point is cynicism. Having seen the limits of understanding, the empath may be tempted to retreat into superiority or disdain. This is a subtle trap, one that signals the shadow of the new position. Silence can harden into withdrawal, discernment into judgment. The task of individuation demands something more difficult: to remain open without being porous, to remain compassionate without being consumed. This balance is not achieved through effort, but through ongoing dialogue with the unconscious. As the empath learns to inhabit this balance, a new relationship to conflict emerges. Previously, conflict was experienced as a rupture that had to be repaired through explanation and emotional labor. Now, Conflict is allowed to exist. Differences are tolerated without immediate resolution. The empath no longer rushes to harmonize opposing forces, but allows tension to speak for itself. Psychologically, this is a profound shift. Tension, when endured, becomes a source of insight. It reveals where values diverge, where expectations were unspoken, where projections operated unseen. In this way, the empath begins to live more symbolically, rather than reacting to the literal content of interactions. They attend to their meaning. Silence becomes a symbol, misunderstanding a message, distance a form of information. The psyche no longer insists that everything be made explicit. It trusts that what is essential will reveal itself in time, without coercion. This trust is not naive. It is born of disillusionment and tempered by self-knowledge. The empath knows now that no amount of clarity can guarantee being received. That understanding is not something one can force into existence. This knowledge brings humility. One relinquishes the fantasy of control over others' inner worlds. And in relinquishing control, one relinquishes a hidden form of power that was never truly healthy. I have often said that where love rules, power has no will, and where power rules, love has no voice. The empath, in their earlier configuration, often confused love with a subtle will to power, the power to heal, to soothe, to make sense of what others could not, by stepping back, by no longer insisting on being understood. This will dissolve. What remains is a quieter love, one that does not seek to manage or redeem. From this quieter love arises a new ethic of relationship. The empath no longer offers themselves as a psychic instrument for others' comfort. They offer presence, but not at the expense of self-abandonment. They listen, but they do not absorb. They speak, but they do not justify. This ethic may feel foreign at first, both to the empath and to those around them, but over time it reveals itself as more sustainable, more truthful in the deeper layers of the unconscious. This transformation resonates with ancient initiatory patterns. In many traditions, the initiate must undergo a period of silence, of withdrawal from the community, before returning in a new role. During this silence, the old identity dissolves. The initiate is no longer who they were, but not yet who they will become. The empath who stops wanting to be understood inhabits this liminal space. It is uncomfortable precisely because it cannot be named or explained. Yet it is in this namelessness that the self makes itself known. The self does not speak in arguments or narratives. It speaks through alignment, through a sense of rightness that cannot be defended but does not need to be. When the empath begins to act from this alignment, their life acquires a different rhythm. Decisions become simpler, not because they are easier, but because they are no longer negotiated through fear of misunderstanding. This simplicity can be mistaken for coldness by those who remain invested in emotional complexity. But simplicity, psychologically, is a sign of integration. It suggests that opposing forces within the psyche have found a working relationship. The empath no longer oscillates between overexposure and withdrawal, between explanation and resentment. There is a steadiness, a consistency that does not depend on external response. One of the most telling signs of this integration is how the empath relates to misunderstanding itself. Previously, misunderstanding felt like erasure, like being unseen or invalidated. Now, it is recognized as inevitable. No two psyches overlap completely. To demand total understanding is to deny individuality. The empath accepts this, not with resignation, but with realism. And in doing so, they free themselves from a lifelong struggle against the limits of human perception. This acceptance does not mean that understanding ceases to matter. It means that it is no longer the condition for self-respect. When understanding occurs, it is welcomed. When it does not, life continues. The empath's inner continuity is preserved. This continuity is perhaps the greatest gift of the entire process. It is a sense that one exists from moment to moment without fragmentation, without the need to constantly adjust or explain. As this continuity strengthens, creativity often awakens. Energy once spent on emotional labor becomes available for inner exploration, for symbolic thought, for expression that does not aim to persuade. The empath may find themselves drawn to writing, art, contemplation, or simply to deeper engagement with their own inner images. The psyche, no longer outwardly drained, turns inward with curiosity rather than desperation. In this inward turn, the empath may encounter layers of sadness that were previously masked by usefulness, grief for the self that was never protected, for the needs that were always postponed. This grief must be felt, not explained away. It is part of the reckoning that individuation demands, but unlike earlier suffering, this grief is contained within a larger sense of meaning. It does not overwhelm, it deepens. Eventually, something quietly radical occurs. The empath realizes that they no longer need an audience for their inner life. Thoughts, feelings, insights can arise and pass without being shared. This does not impoverish experience, it enriches it. The psyche rediscovers the intimacy of solitude, the richness of inner dialogue unmediated by external reaction. This is not the end of relationship, but the end of dependency. From this place, the empath can meet others as separate centers, not as mirrors or extensions of their own psyche. Relationship becomes a meeting rather than a merging. And in this meeting, a new kind of understanding becomes possible, one that does not erase difference but honors it. The day the empath stops wanting to be understood, then is the day the psyche relinquishes a childish hope and gains an adult freedom. It is the day one accepts that to be human is to be partially unknowable, both to others and to oneself. This acceptance does not diminish love, it purifies it. Love becomes less anxious, less demanding, more grounded in reality. I will continue, for there remains one final movement in this process, where silence, having done its work, gives rise to a form of speech that carries the weight of individuation itself, and where the empath, no longer seeking understanding, becomes capable of offering something far rarer, truth without attachment. When this final movement begins, the empath discovers that speech itself has transformed. Words are no longer instruments of persuasion, no longer tools to secure recognition or empathy. They are now vessels of presence, carriers of the inner reality that does not depend on acknowledgement. When the empath speaks, the voice has depth, resonance, and inevitability. There is a quality to it that cannot be argued with, because it is not a statement of opinion, but an articulation of inner alignment. It is the voice of someone who has inhabited the full terrain of their own psyche and has returned to the world not weaker, not louder, but more complete. This voice carries a curious paradox. It is both detached and magnetic. People notice it, even if they do not fully understand it. It exerts influence without effort, not through manipulation, not through explanation, but through the sheer authenticity of presence. It is as if the empath, having relinquished the need to be understood, has tapped into a deeper current of human connectivity, one that does not rely on verbal negotiation or validation. Others may feel the power of this silence, the weight of unspoken depth, and sense that something has changed, though they cannot name it. The archetypal significance of this transformation is profound. The empath moves from the archetype of the wounded healer, who is defined by service to others, into the archetype of the sage or the silent oracle. The oracle is not defined by response or by the need to be witnessed. The oracle exists within a continuum of knowledge and insight that transcends ordinary relational exchange. Here, the empath becomes both observer and participant, fully engaged with life, yet no longer entangled in the compulsive need to clarify, justify, or explain. Symbolically, this stage can be seen in dreams and visions as crossing a threshold or entering a sacred chamber. The empath may dream of walking through a labyrinth, and at the center, finding a wellspring that is their own. The waters are clear, untainted, and the reflection is complete. There is no echo from others, because it is unnecessary. The ego has released its grip, the shadow has been integrated, and the self is quietly manifesting. The imagery is never dramatic, it is serene, yet charged with the potency of psychic transformation. It is important to note that this transformation is not instantaneous nor guaranteed. It often comes after long periods of inner struggle, disillusionment, and fatigue. The empath may resist withdrawal, cling to old habits of over-explanation, or confuse detachment with apathy. The psyche, however, is persistent through subtle signals, bodily tension, recurring dreams, repeated relational friction. It directs the empath toward the inevitability of this shift. Resistance only prolongs suffering. Acceptance initiates liberation. As the empath navigates this new interior landscape, relationships themselves shift in character. Those who were once dependent on the empath's explanatory capacity may pull away, confused or frustrated. Others may deepen, drawn to the empath's newfound stability and authenticity. Importantly, the empath no longer defines relationship success by the measure of being understood. Instead, connection is measured by resonance, mutuality, and the capacity for respectful distance. This is a higher form of intimacy, one that honors both self and other. In psychological terms, the empath is now exercising a sovereignty of consciousness. Previously, the psychic energy was dispersed through constant attunement to others. Now it is contained, focused, and aligned with the inner self. This realignment enhances creativity, insight, and personal resilience. Energy that was once spent in endless translation and justification is now available for reflection, imagination, and deliberate action. The empath begins to operate from depth rather than diffusion, from presence rather than pursuit. The spiritual dimension of this transformation is equally profound. In many mystical traditions, withdrawal and silence are prerequisites for initiation. They prepare the individual to receive insights that cannot be mediated through ordinary social channels. The empath, in relinquishing the need to be understood, mirrors this initiation. Silence becomes sacred. Misunderstanding becomes instructive. And solitude becomes a field in which the self can reveal itself without distortion. In this sense, the empath's journey is not only psychological but profoundly spiritual, touching the archetypal structure of consciousness itself. Interestingly, the world often reacts in ways that mirror the empath's transformation. Those accustomed to the empath's over-attunement may experience discomfort, irritation, or fascination. This reaction is a reflection of their own unconscious need to control or be understood. The empath, however, no longer engages in this dynamic. Their withdrawal from the need to be understood creates a ripple, an unconscious invitation for others to confront their own projections, to meet reality without mediation. Eventually, a quiet equilibrium emerges. The empath exists fully within their own experience, accessible yet autonomous. Words are chosen, presence is measured, and engagement is deliberate rather than compulsive. Understanding, when it occurs, is a gift rather than a requirement. Misunderstanding, when it occurs, is a neutral fact rather than a psychic wound. This equilibrium is not static, it is dynamic, continuously recalibrated through awareness, reflection, and the subtle interplay between ego and self. From the perspective of the collective unconscious, this shift has implications far beyond the individual. The empath, no longer over-invested in managing others' perceptions, contributes to relational dynamics in a fundamentally new way. They model a form of engagement that does not demand conformity, that honors difference, and that embodies integrity. In this way, their presence can catalyze growth in others, not through instruction or correction, but through the quiet authority of a psyche that has reconciled its own depth. It is in this state that true creativity and insight flourish, without the distraction of seeking validation or negotiating understanding. The empath can perceive subtle patterns, symbolic resonances, and archetypal dynamics that were previously obscured. Their inner life becomes a laboratory, a sacred space in which observation, reflection, and transformation are possible. The outer world is no longer a constant mirror. It is a canvas upon which the psyche may project and explore its own images. The final paradox is that, having relinquished the need to be understood, the empath is more accessible, more compelling, and more deeply relational than ever before. Ironically, the very act of release that seemed to isolate them opens the door to more authentic connection. Others are drawn not to the compulsion of explanation, but to the integrity, presence, and depth that now define the empath. They become, in effect, a conduit for relational authenticity that transcends ordinary social exchange. And so we arrive at the essential truth. The day an empath stops wanting to be understood is not the day they withdraw from the world, but the day they enter it more fully. It is the day the ego's demands fall away, the shadow is integrated, and the self asserts its quiet, sovereign presence. It is the day that understanding, while still possible, is no longer necessary. It is the day that the empath becomes whole, not by being reflected in others, but by being reflected in the depths of their own consciousness. In this fullness, life continues with a new rhythm, a new gravity, and a new clarity. The empath's journey has transformed, not by addition but by subtraction, not by gaining the world's acknowledgement, but by reclaiming their own psychic space. Words, relationships, emotions all acquire a depth and intentionality that were previously impossible. The psyche has moved through its necessary crucible and emerges aligned, centered, and unbound by the compulsions that once dictated its movements. And in this, the empath touches the essence of individuation, to exist without needing to be validated, to engage without seeking approval, to speak without demanding comprehension. Here, the journey of being fully human, aware, sensitive, and sovereign begins anew, and with it, the empath is free to inhabit a life both quiet and profound, both solitary and connected, both unknown and luminous. This completes the full arc of the empath's transformation in the terms we have explored, from the earliest compulsions to the final emergence of sovereign presence